Teddy Roosevelt, Rough Rider, president, and cultural icon. Roosevelt was a man who became a transformative figure in the 20th century. Ascending to the presidency during the Gilded Age, big business had dominated American life since the Civil War. A combination of new technological innovations and a legacy of corruption during Reconstruction, American industry rapidly grew, becoming the premier producer of steel and one of the fastest growing economies in the world. This growth generated wealth unimaginable in the past, with some of the richest men to ever live gaining their fortunes in this period, such as Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and John D. Rockefeller. Unfortunately, this wealth was not equally distributed, and oftentimes living conditions of the average American remained stagnant or deteriorated. While critics argue this was a natural result of the free market and social Darwinism, the reality is most, if not all, of these captains of industry were beneficiaries of government subsidies. The dominance of big business led to the rise of the populist movement, though was generally ineffective, as both Republicans and Democrats remained dedicated to big business. This changed when in 1896, Nebraska Congressman William Jennings Bryan won the Democratic nomination due to his charismatic speeches and promise he would put the robber barons behind bars. Bryan stood in contrast to his Republican foe, William McKinley, Ohio governor and close friend of businessman power broker Mark Hanna, who played a key role in McKinley gaining the nomination. The election proved to be close, but McKinley would win in large part due to his backing of big business. McKinley as president would maintain the Republican tradition of high tariffs and focus on industrial development, overseeing a full recovery after the economic recession. During his presidency, McKinley would also see the U.S. engage in war with Spain, a conflict which Theodore Roosevelt engaged in the famous Rough Riders, launching him to national fame and eventually winning him the governorship of New York. Roosevelt had campaigned in his governorship on progressive reforms to civil services and regulating big business, a move that upset party bosses. Their solution was to nominate Roosevelt as McKinley's vice president in 1900 to snuff out his rising star. McKinley would be re-elected in 1900, but 6 months into his second term, he would be assassinated by anarchist Leon Czolgosz, marking Roosevelt's rise to the presidency. Roosevelt as president would swiftly enact policies of regulations and trust busting to put an end to powerful monopolies. Roosevelt also saw the rise of the U.S. on the global stage, brokering a peace between Japan and Russia, earning him a Nobel Peace Prize. Roosevelt's presidency put an end to the Gilded Age and marked the beginning of the Progressive Age. But what if this colossal figure never became president? As mentioned before, Roosevelt was made vice president by the GOP party bosses to prevent him from rising in prominence, but in a twist of fate, the very decision would lead to his meteoric rise. The easiest solution is McKinley simply survives his assassination and serves his second term. Roosevelt, as such, never rises to prominence in the Republican Party. So how would things change? McKinley is arguably one of the most misunderstood U.S. presidents, with much of his actions being more complex than what first meets the eye, and oftentimes quite contradicting. Despite being painted as a puppet to big business, McKinley was sympathetic to the plight of the common workers, and worked closely with union leaders such as Terence Powderly and Samuel Gompers in his administration. In McKinley's second inaugural address, he directly calls out recklessness of big business, implying he would have enacted stronger policies towards out-of-control monopolies. It's safe to speculate McKinley would have enacted moderate labor reforms and regulations, but kept an overall pro-business policy, continuing America's great growth while not neglecting the common people. There would still be progressive Republicans and Democrats who would call for further reforms, potentially giving more prominence to the progressive movement, but with both parties' establishments being pro-business, it is unlikely the progressives would have any political capital to enact radical change. Another misunderstood aspect of William McKinley was his foreign policy, in which McKinley is often viewed as a warmonger, launching America into the imperialist game, but again, this is more complicated for McKinley. The genesis of American imperialism is often credited to the Spanish-American War in 1888. However, McKinley was not completely on board with the initial calls for war. Even after the war, McKinley was not interested in colonial expansion, even attempting to reject annexing the Philippines, which led to the unfortunate misunderstanding in the Philippines they had gained independence, but learned later that they were under U.S. control, leading to the bloody Philippine-American War. McKinley's foreign policy was by and large based much more on cooperation rather than subjugation, and also showed his willingness to break away from Republican protectionism with his open-door policy in China and his negotiating of construction of the Panama Canal. McKinley would also likely continue this policy of having closer relations in Latin America and especially China. He would likewise seek to stabilize neighboring countries like Mexico and Haiti as a means to secure American hegemony and stabilizing the Western Hemisphere. McKinley would most likely retire from office at the end of his second term, leaving the question of who would succeed him. The Democrats might still nominate William Jennings Bryan given his influence in the party and continuously being the nominee despite failures in our timeline. But this could lead to the Democrats nominating a more conservative Bourbon like Alton B. Parker. Likewise, the Republicans would have a difficult time finding a successor for McKinley. Without Roosevelt, it's unlikely William Howard Taft would rise to prominence, but two figures that could emerge were Elihu Root and Charles Evans Hughes. Root was a conservative who was McKinley's Secretary of War before being promoted to Secretary of State under Theodore Roosevelt, where he held great influence such as promoting good relations in Latin America, enacting moderate civil service reforms, and promoting peaceful arbitration between countries, eventually leading to the formation of the Permanent Court of International Justice, which earned him a Nobel Peace Prize in 1912. Hughes, on the other hand, was on the Supreme Court and who had been a moderate progressive, having previously been governor of New York. More than likely, Republicans would nominate Root to continue McKinley's policies, whereas the Democrats would nominate Bryan as the Bourbon Democrats had been losing power, with the Democrats' core base shifting to the rural West. Come the election of 1904, Root would likely ride McKinley's popularity, handing Bryan a third straight loss. Root's presidency would be similar to Theodore Roosevelt's in our timeline, as previously mentioned having been his Secretary of State, though, like McKinley, he would take only moderate action against big businesses while focusing on foreign cooperation. Root might also take a closer notice of German expansion in Europe, and seek a closer alliance with Britain and France, which would set up American intervention in World War I in 1914. Inversely, Root might attempt to take a preventative measure similar to the Root-Takahira Agreement, which curbed the growing tensions between the US and Japan in the Pacific. Being a foreign policy wizard, he might be able to create various agreements in Europe to ensure armed conflict remained contained to a small scale, or possibly even create an earlier version of the League of Nations, as he had supported in our timeline. By the end of Root's presidency, however, he will have ensured that the US holds a permanent place on the world stage. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.